Farmer Tom here. Welcome to the Farmer Tomcast. Today on our ongoing series, Heroes of the Green, we've got Brian Niestrath. How's it going, Brian?
Good. Thank you, Farmer Tom. Pleasure to be here.
Oh, man. Pleasure's mine. So the world wants to hear your multi-generational legendary story, bro. So I'll hand the mic over to you.
All right, cool. Well, thank you. So my name again, is Brian Niestrath, and my wife and I are the owners of Green Bandit, and we are a recreational producer here in Southern Oregon. We're a tier 2 sun-grown producer, and we grow full term. So no hoop houses or light dep or anything like that. Just a very natural grow. We've recently been certified through Sun and Earth, which is puts us. It verifies that we're doing all organic practices within our farm, but they also add to this, as the name suggests, you're growing under the sun and in the earth. So that's Sun and Earth. So we are growing in the native soil. Sun and Earth is not only looking into organics, but also regenerative farming practices. They also add to their list of criteria some community outreach components as well as worker rights components. And so when I read through all of those requirements, I was really impressed that Sun and Earth is a entity out there that's looking to encourage farmers to do similar practices to our own. It also enables us to dig deeper and find more things that we can do. And it ties us into this greater community of organic regenerative farmers who are pursuing all things in that realm. And so if I have a question, now I have a really good resource to go to and ask that question. So that's the breakdown of Green Bandit, at least to introduce myself. And I think the way that I'll go about this today is since we're talking about legacy farms and the history of cannabis and legal cannabis and where all of that's come from and where we are today, I'll just start at the beginning with how I got here. So, because I wasn't Green Bandit to begin with. That's where we are today. So, I grew up in Southern Oregon. I graduated from Ashland High School, and I was born in the Ashland Hospital, and grew up on Indian Memorial Road. My dad bought a property up there when he was, I want to say between 22 and 24 years old. And today he's 72. So he's been there for a while. And anyhow, he moved up from Southern California. He grew up in Long Beach and had a friend who moved to Southern Oregon. He came up and visited in his early 20s and just fell in love with Southern Oregon. The next thing he did was went home to Long Beach, gathered up all of his stuff, and headed to Oregon. He didn't have any plan other than just to be here. And I'm really thankful that he did, because we still have family in Long Beach. We still visit Long Beach, but I'm very thankful that I grew up in Ashland, Oregon, one of the most beautiful places that I've ever been to. And I get to call that home. So Dad was here in his 20s, and surely he was growing cannabis in his yard for fun, hobby stuff, to have some good smoke, that kind of thing in those days. And so were his friends and the people he was around. And so they've always had a good time with cannabis. They've all been responsible people who raised me and that I was around as my mentors and influencers in my life. And many of those people that I grew up around used cannabis, again, responsibly on their own throughout their lives. So I was raised around that. Those were the people that again influenced me. And at some point in my childhood, there was a time when my dad and mom told us that they were going to grow some special flowers and that they needed a special permit for these flowers, which they didn't have yet. And so they didn't want us to talk much about it. And I was telling Farmer Tom this the other day, just over the phone conversation we had. But anyhow, it's just it's funny for me to look back on it, because they were trying to grow cannabis indoors. And when I'd peek my head into the closet and see what was going on, I'd see some green foliage, but I never saw a flower. And I always thought my parents were pretty bad at growing flowers. And so, and that only lasted for maybe even just a few months, but I remember it pretty well. And so then if we fast forward to myself and my brother being in high school, we had friends who, smoked cannabis, and we did too. And we kind of all got into it at a young age, younger than I would recommend my nephews get into it and things like that. And which I would say I now have nephews who are in their late teens and early 20s who have now graduated Ashland High School. And I influenced them in a positive way in which they all stayed away from cannabis much longer than we did. Many of them don't smoke. But at the time that we were kids, cannabis was just illegal, no matter who you were. It wasn't that you had to be 21. It was that cannabis is illegal for mom and dad. It's illegal for us kids. And there was no frame of reference for us as to say, when would it be a good time for us to participate in cannabis? So when we were young, we just did what they told us not to do. And so I see a huge difference from our generation to just the next generation behind us. Again, my nephews, who now they've grown up around it. They've seen the plants legally being grown around them, and they've known people who responsibly use it and talk to them about it in a responsible manner. So rather than the story that we heard, which was, you stay away from this, the story they heard was, we use this, but we've learned how to use it responsibly, and there is a responsible way to use this. And so by talking to the kids in a much more even keel way, and by the plant itself being appreciated in a different way by society, it really enabled us to see a generation of kids, at least around me, come up who were more or less disinterested in cannabis. Whereas for us, it was a big deal. So that's just something that I'm glad to share that, because I was smoking cannabis pretty regularly from the time I was 15, 16 years old. And I do think that's too early. And no doubt, actually. Because I think that my childhood could have been a little more smooth and things could have been easier. But nonetheless, we came through that time. Cannabis prohibition existed, and we were there for that. So as I was 15 years old, I had other friends that started to grow in their closets, kind of had permission from their parents or whatever. Maybe their parents would look the other way. And mine wouldn't, but my parents were working all the time and didn't have much involvement in my personal life. So I blacked out my closet, and I put a few plants and a few fluorescent lights into this closet, and attempted to grow in my bedroom closet when I was 15 years old. And, no ventilation, nothing. And it never did anything. I got some seeds to germinate, and that was about it. But that's where it begins for me. And then by the time I graduated high school, let's say, I was probably 19 years old, I think, when medical marijuana became a thing. And people were beginning to get permits to, consume cannabis, and others are getting permits to grow cannabis. And I know when I was 21 years old, my dad got his property registered as a grow site, a medical grow site. And we took on some medical patients who we met through the cooperative that registers people for their medical grow licenses. So one of the alternative medicine facilities, I think, is who connected us with patients. And so we started growing for patients that we didn't even know. But again, back at that time, there were very few medical patients out there. We were just coming from a time when weed was just outright illegal to now, like, some people can have it. And if they do the paperwork and they do it all right and they follow the rules. So even though my dad was growing medically, it still seemed like a very underground thing. Like, we didn't have any way to confirm that no one was going to come in and knock down the doors and, take everything away. So during those times, it was still pretty hush and everything else. And again, it wasn't like it is now, where many people that I know are medical patients. Back then, I remember being conflicted about myself or anyone else getting a card, because it's like, now you're on the radar. That was my thinking. And again, coming from a time of prohibition and being a person who really doesn't want to spend any time in jail or dealing with law enforcement at all. I remember just through the years of growing medical cannabis, always being a little bit worried, just a little bit worried that, for some reason we were gonna see the wrong side of the law for doing it. And people would get busted all the time. Every summer there were big busts that would happen and things like that. So anyhow, and that's going back to when I was 21. And at that time, I met some people who were helping my dad to understand how to grow. And he was growing indoors at the time, because again, with the fear of being in trouble, we didn't even want to grow outdoor, even though we had paperwork that said that we could grow outdoors. We just felt like it was more risky. And so my dad was all set up growing indoor. And I met with the people that were coaching him, and it was pretty quick that we started connecting, me and the other mentors. And so information was going through me over to my dad. And so over time, I kind of took over on a lot of the operations, on pest management, on watering, on setting up a good irrigation system, ventilation. These are all things that I just started to learn from observing and from having it kind of coached to me. So I enjoyed growing cannabis from the time I was 21 until my kind of mid to late 20s. We were growing medically. And at some point around Southern Oregon, we could see that more and more people were being more comfortable with growing outdoors and growing proper plants, not under a tree, not in a hidden space like what an outdoor grower would have done when I was a kid. People were putting it out there in the field, and you could see it from the road and things like this. We thought that was like really, really bold. I remember in those days, I was also a carpenter. I've been a carpenter for a long time, going back to high school also. And we would be driving to job sites, and we would just kind of count grows, and we would kind of look at like who's more bold than the other and that stuff. And we would just think it was so wild. But anyway, we saw enough of that we kind of got that school of fish kind of mentality. And we said, well, let's grow outdoors, like everybody else is doing it. Let's do it. So we cleared a little space on my dad's property. We had one tree that got cut down to kind of create the big environment that we needed with respect to sunlight and everything else. And we mounted all of the medical cards, laminated them, and mounted them to the stump of that tree. So they were facing up, so that when the helicopters would fly over our grow, they could look down with their binoculars and go, okay, cool. I see that the numbers are all there and this lines up and it's good. So, those were the old days. And sure enough, we had helicopters flying over the grow every single year that we were growing medical. And even at a time there was a period of time in Southern Oregon when I believe it was the Air National Guard would send 10 or 12 helicopters down to the Rogue Valley, big mega helicopters, in addition to the local law enforcement. We'd have these like wild, aerial dragnet situations going on overhead with these big, gnarly military helicopters. How much money and fuel all that costs and everything else, I couldn't imagine. And so it did feel oppressive. Cannabis always felt oppressive to me, or at least from the authoritative side, right? From the legal side, it always felt like a pretty risky and oppressive place to be up until recreational cannabis came along. But I would say that I fell in love with farming and with growing cannabis at the time that we did move outside. Even though we were having the helicopters and all of that, I just loved the plant so much more, seeing it in its natural environment. And so I really took to it And then that's when I kind of thought this is something I could do long term. I would always like to have at least my own plants outside. This is fun. And so that led to farming other things, food production and things like that. And so I've just been, very interested in growing under the sun and in the earth for a long time now. So then in 2017, we had the opportunity to take a loan and get over here to a piece of property and grow recreationally, where I could do things like this, be involved in an interview. I could talk about cannabis, talk about the business, and we can pay our taxes and do pay our taxes and all of that stuff. I jumped at that opportunity. Very excited to be a member of the legal recreational cannabis industry. So